I think everyone will agree we've got a great lineup of lectures today. There's something here for everybody, I think. I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you to Sarah and to David for putting together such a great collection of lectures for us.
Peter has been an active participant in the DVB project based in Geneva, where he was recently a member of the steering board, vice chair of the commercial module and chair of the commercial study mission on WiB, hence he's here. He's also a member of the Confederation of Aero Industries Technical Committee and he's provided training in broadcast technologies to regulators and others, and drafted much of the reference manual for the Society's service technician course. So a hand for Peter.
Thank you very much for that introduction, David, and good morning to everybody. What I'm going to try and explain over the next half an hour or so is some of the processes that DVB uses to look at technologies and decide what it's going to do with them. And this is a particularly interesting case because there is this thing called WiB, which I guess some of you may have heard of. Can I perhaps have just a quick show of hands? Who has some idea what WiB might be? Oh, gosh, 2 hands in the room. Excellent. Splendid. Well, hopefully by a few minutes' time you'll all know quite a bit more about it. This looks like a very promising technology. So I want to explain to you what DVB did with this technology and where we've ended up with it. Perhaps a slightly unusual title, because usually at lectures like this you get somebody saying, oh, we've got this wonderful technology and it's going to solve all the world's problems, but I'm saying, well, it's a slightly different end, you may have gathered from that title. Okay, a little bit about DVB first. These specifications are probably the most widely known ones to people. DVB C and C2 for cable, S and S2 and S2X for satellite, and T and T2. And these are sometimes, these are all the sort of modulation and channel coding standards, and these are sometimes called the crown jewels of the DVB, because I guess they are the ones that are probably most forward-facing, most familiar to most people. You can see that the standards have been developed over quite a period of time. 1994 was when they first started coming out. In fact, DVB is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, I believe it is. And we have this set of specifications. And what we're going to look at is what might have been added on here, a sort of perhaps a T3, if you like. DVB standards have been adopted all over the world. We're looking at the blue areas here for the T and the T2 standards, and you can see that that covers quite a high proportion of the territories of the world. And this, I apologise, the writing's a bit tiny. Perhaps some of you in the front row might be able to read it, but I'll explain a little bit. This is basically to show the relative take-up of DVB and non-DVB standards around the world. The orangey, browny coloured bars, which work off the the right-hand axis, are the number of countries who have adopted DVB or other standards. and the blue lines represent the populations of those countries. Now, I should be careful here and say adoption means they've said they will use it, they may already be using it, they may not be using it, and the population is not necessarily the number of people who are actually covered by DVB transmissions. So it's potentially who could be covered if those countries implemented 100% networks. You can see at the far bar on the left-hand side, you've got DVB T2, so that's a pretty high bar. And you've got the next bar along is DTMB, then you've got ISDB, and then those countries who've adopted mixtures of DVB and so on, DVB-T and DVB-T2, as we have in the UK at the moment. We have both standards operating. And then the right-hand bar shows what you get if you add up all of the DVB standards. So you can see that DVB has definitely taken the lion's share. Okay, let's get on to the what is WiB bit. WiB was a candidate technology for the next generation DVB digital terrestrial television networks. So, as I've already mentioned, it could have been a T3 perhaps. The principles of WiB are described in a paper that was published at IBC 2016, or presented there, and I think I can't remember which prize it was that it won. I think it was best technical paper or something like that. The paper's called WiB, a new system concept for digital terrestrial television, DTT, and was principally authored by Eric Starrer of Terracom. He's actually now moved on to Ericsson, but he was a very well-known figure in DVB circles for many years, as Eric, with a lot of expertise brought to the terrestrial world. WiB actually stands for Wideband Reuse 1. It's probably easier to understand where the WiB bit relates to wideband. The Reuse 1 bit sort of got lost somewhere. I don't think anybody could think of a suitable sort of abbreviation for that. But we tack it on the end because that's an important feature of what WiB is about, and we'll be going on to explain that in a minute or two. So let's have a look at the wideband bit of it. These blue rectangles here represent multiplexes that we transmit in current typical networks, and the divisions along the horizontal aspect or horizontal axis are 8 megahertz channels that we use in the UK. There are other channel bandwidths used in other locations, but let's just go with 8 megahertz for the time being. And typically in a country like UK, Western European countries, you might find 5, 6, 7 multiplexes like that, each transmitted at quite high power and carrying a data capacity of typically up to about 40 megabits per second. And the difference really with what we're talking about in the WiB, the wideband, is that instead of transmitting these high power multiplexes, what we're going to do with WiB is look at transmitting lots more lower power, lower capacity multiplexes. So those are illustrated by the yellow blocks along the bottom there. Now, frequency reuse. I want to talk about that second element that we hadn't really got a good abbreviation for. Those tall blue rectangles in the previous slide illustrate that we're having to transmit those multiplexes at quite high power because they're using high order modulation up to 256 QAM. So they need quite high carrier to interference ratios. Typically sort of heading towards 20 dB is what you're looking to. And so this means that if you want to use a particular frequency in one location, you can't reuse that same frequency in another location that's very nearby, because the interference that would put into your signal would mean that you wouldn't be able to meet that 20 dB carrier to interference ratio. So what we're looking at in this rather colourful diagram here is an idealised coverage map, and each one of those hexagons with a number in the middle is intended to represent the coverage area of a transmitter. Well, everybody knows, of course, that they're never hexagonal like that, but it's very helpful for doing sort of first-line simulation of networks to be able to work on a simple basis like this. Then when you've got some results that look interesting, you can start refining it for real-world networks, where you've got other things that come into play, such as the terrain and other propagation aspects. And so if you look, for example, at this number 2 in the middle here, consider that one. If you look at this network, then you find that that frequency is not reused until the distance of those white arrows away. And you can arrange it so that that distance is big enough that the transmitters that reuse the same frequency put sufficiently little interference into that central purple 2 area that you do meet your interference criteria, and so everything works. So what this tells us is that if you want to represent a region or a country that's covered by a matrix of transmitters, each one of these hexagonal areas being one transmitter's coverage area, you would actually need, in this instance, 7 channels to cover the entire region with one multiplex of data. Now with WiB, what we're going to do is go to the other end of the scale, as it were, in terms of the ruggedness of the signals. And now, reuse 1 is what we're looking for, because reuse 1 lets you use one RF channel right across the entire region. And because the channels are quite rugged, then the interference level that you get from the adjacent area is now perhaps you're looking at a carrier to interference ratio requirement of maybe 4 or 5 dB. That's a lot easier to meet, and that kind of discrimination can be provided by antenna performance and so on. So reuse 1 lets you use every RF channel in every transmitter service area for any content, and that's the distinction you have to make with this thing called single frequency networks, which are quite widely used with current technology. Quick diversion into single frequency networks. Basically, at UHF, you've got a lot of reflections. UHF signals tend to bounce off buildings and other obstructions, and so you end up with this thing called multipath, where there is a path directly from the transmitter to your receiver, but there's another path which is bouncing off a building, and it's a slightly longer path, so the signal that takes that route arrives a little bit later. Now, if you've got a very short symbol time in a data transmission, then you can end up with massive amounts of inter-symbol interference between those 2 paths. But what we do in the technology that we use here, COFDM as it's called, Coded Orthogonal Frequency Division Multiplex, is we divide up that data into about 6,000 channels, so the data rate on any one of the carriers is 6,000 times longer than it would be, and now there is plenty of overlap between the same symbols, and there's only a relatively small proportion of each symbol where the inter-symbol interference actually occurs, and you can eliminate that, and so you can make it all work. In a single frequency network, somebody said, oh, well, the transmitter next door, how's that going, the interference received from that? If we make that transmission exactly the same as the transmission from your wanted transmitter, then how is the receiver going to tell the difference between the signal that's coming from an interfering transmitter and one that's bouncing off a building? If you time it up right, then it all works, and that's how a single frequency network operates. The constraint is that the content of each of those interfering areas must be exactly the same and exactly co-timed for this all to work. It does work. They are used in the field, and very successfully too. WiB says, no, you don't even have to do that, because the different content can be used on the same frequency in the next adjacent service area. But of course there's a drawback with going to the more rugged mode, and that is that because you're using, say, QPSK instead of 256 QAM on each carrier, you're carrying an awful lot less data. So less data means fewer programs in each multiplex. So let's have a look at some of the implications then of what this would bring us. This is back to the diagram you saw earlier on. We've got the high power existing DTT multiplexers. If we call that power level 100%, it works out that the power level per 8 megahertz channel that you'd need for the wideband transmission is roughly 2% of the power that you'd need in one of those taller 8 megahertz transmissions. It actually means that the total power, if you've got 28 UHF TV channels available to you, as we will when the 700 megahertz band clearance completes, the total power of all those 28 channels is actually less than one of these. So you could actually handle the whole thing in one amplifier. And that's quite a significant saving. Having one amplifier also means that you don't need combining equipment. And that is also a massive saving. If you've been used to combining signals in cable systems and small things like that, a combiner might be a little thing about this big. It's a bit different for transmitters. Let me show you first of all the transmitter hall. These are from Crystal Palace. You can see in here 1, 2, 3 sets of equipment and 3 more on here. So that's the transmission equipment, the power amplifiers, the modulators and so on that's needed for 6 multiplexes. And you can see the size of the feeders, the big sort of coppery feeder going across the top there. Those go into the next room where they enter all this sort of equipment. And you can see a few heads in the background there and a chap standing at the far end to get the scale of this. There's an awful lot of plumbing, and it's quite precise because the characteristics of this combining unit are very well defined. Its purpose is to bring the power of those transmitters all into one feeder that then goes up the mast to the transmitting aerial, and also at the same time providing isolation so that the output power, or very little of the output power of one amplifier, finds its way back into any of the other amplifiers, where if you put much power in that way, you get an awful lot of intermodulation and all sorts of unwanted effects going on. So the characteristics of this equipment are really quite specific, and it's not cheap, should we say. So that would appear to be giving us some really extensive cost savings on the transmission equipment. Now, when you're introducing something like WiB, you've got the opportunity to review what else you do in the system, and that gives you an opportunity to introduce newer technologies in other areas that are not strictly WiB themselves, but they arrive with WiB as an opportunity to actually put them in. So, for example, using the latest generation of video coding would give you quite a significant advantage. MPEG-2 is still in widespread use. MPEG-4 has happened since then. Since then, there was HEVC. And by the time we were looking at when WiB would turn into a usable standard, if we went down that route, that might be in the early sort of 2022-ish, something like that. We would expect yet another generation, an encoding technology called VVC, for example. Other ones are available, or will be available. VVC stands for Versatile Video Coding. We're expecting this to emerge 2020-ish from ITU, produced by the Joint Video Experts team there. And basically, as a rule of thumb, what we're saying is, very roughly, and don't pin me to the wall on this one, each time you jump forward a generation, you roughly halve the bit rate that you need to transmit to obtain a picture of the same quality as the previous generation. So you can see that by the time you get to be able to leapfrog a couple of generations, the gain you can get in terms of channels that you can carry in a given bit rate of channel are getting to be really, really very substantial. So that's clearly something you would want to look at, is moving to the latest generation video coding technology. Another thing you can do is look at how you might manage statistical multiplexing. Statistical multiplexing is a process that we use quite a lot in various forms of broadcast technology. Basically, if you've got an encoding process with some video going into it, the bit rate coming out tends to be related to the amount that's going on in the picture. In other words, if the picture's quite static, nothing happening at all, you've got to send a picture once, then there isn't anything left to send until something happens in the picture, like something moves or you cut to another scene or whatever it may be. So the demand for bitrate from a given channel of video depends upon the content of that video. And you can look at the demand in a statistical way when you start bunching numbers of channels together. And what this means is that, let's say to reach a certain quality you need to allocate, I don't know, let's pluck a figure out of the air and say 5 megabits to a video channel, when most of the time it's running an average of 2 or 3 but has occasional peaks to 5. Well, if it's only running 2 or 3, there are 2 or 3 megabits to give away to somebody else who needs that peak when you don't. And if you've got the mix of channel styles right in there, you can arrange it so that the probability of lots of channels needing their peaks at the same time is sufficiently small that it doesn't happen very often at all. And so what you can do from this is achieve a more consistent video performance, but also you can get more programs into a given bit rate. And the graph here, taken from an EBU technical report, which you can look up online and study in more detail if you're interested in this subject, basically it gives an indication here of the sorts of gains that you can achieve. Clearly it depends upon the program mix. If you mix together a whole load of cameras looking at fish tanks where the tiny little fish were slowly moving backwards and forwards, you'd end up with quite a different statistical nature than if you had a load of football channels, for example, where the camera's panning around and there's detail of the crowd and the grass and everything's flying about. That would have quite a different demand profile from a camera that's looking at fish tank, for example. So this says it's a good idea to be able to put into a statistical multiplexing group as many channels as you can get. Up to this sort of level here, you can get maybe 25% improvement. So that's worth having. Now, there are various caveats around this graph. Don't take it too literally, because there are various things like we don't know if this applies to UHD. I'm not aware that anybody has managed to get sufficient UHD channels together in one group to find out whether this law actually follows there as well. And latest generation codecs and so on will have to be tested to see whether this is true. But in principle, it should apply in some form. It may not be quite the same figures as these, but it means that it is something you want to do. So if you wanted to introduce ultra-high definition television, for example, you couldn't get terribly many of them into a conventional multiplex of 40 megabits. You'd be looking at 2-ish, 3-ish if you're lucky, if you're squeezing them in. So you're not going to get terribly much gain. So there are some advantages here if you can aggregate channels together, so you can build what's called a supermux. This is a very wideband, high bitrate multiplex. Could be as high as over 200 megabits in principle using WiB. And that would then allow you to get reasonably good statistical multiplexing gain out of UHF channels and very good statistical multiplexing gain out of HD channels. Okay, other technologies. There are things like MIMO and antenna-based interference cancellation that we can look at here as well. Antenna-based interference cancellation is a cunning trick that you can do. If you replace the receiving antenna, you can stick a couple of other elements on, which might have directionality to look at interference that's coming in off the main beam of the main part of the antenna. And you can take the signals they receive and feed them down into the receiver, which can then do some clever stuff with it to help eliminate the interference that's happening on the signal that you're actually trying to receive. MIMO and cross-polar transmissions. This basically in the UK, in most instances, not all, we use horizontal polarizations for the main transmitters that we've got, and we use vertical for the little relays that fill in the gaps. What we're saying here is, in principle, because the signal is so rugged now, you can actually use the cross-polar transmission from the same transmitter to carry different services. So you might commercially, for example, want to keep the transmissions that you've already got on one polarization and put enhancements or additional services on the cross-polar signal. There are potentially large gains available if we do this sort of thing, but there are also some problems because the costs of replacing domestic antennas become quite significant. If you go out now and get an installer to put up a new receiving aerial for you, you might be paying, it varies a bit from one region to another, but it might be £150 or something of that order. You could imagine that a slightly more expensive aerial, one with interference cancellation, it would need some kind of device at the top also to frequency translate the signals received off the helper antennas that are built into this, send them all down to the receiver where they're taken apart again. That's beginning to look a bit expensive because everybody who wants to use a new service here would have to get a new aerial as well. And that has other knock-ons because quite a lot of people tend to put one aerial up on the roof and they might well distribute it to the sitting room, to the kitchen, to the bedroom, more bedrooms, bathrooms, you name it. It gets distributed around the house, and if you've got a different format of signal coming off the aerial, then you may find that some of the electronics in the system doesn't work. So you'd have to rebuild a lot of those. Also on master antenna TV systems, we've got quite a lot of those in the UK in the form of MATV and IRS integrated reception systems, which are the ones that carry satellite signals as well. We've got, I think it's a little over 3 million homes in the UK who get their TV signals off these systems, and all of those would need replacing. Well, the last time we did that, it took quite a number of years, and that was with digital switchover, where a lot of the rather ancient systems that have been around a long time were found not really to be suitable for digital in their current format. So a lot of landlords had to put their hands in their pockets and pay quite a bit of money to have these systems replaced and made suitable for the digital signals we now use. I could imagine them being fairly reluctant to want to do that again. So what would we win if we did all this? Well, if we used all the known features, all the stuff that I've been talking about, so that's WiB, the latest coding, using a supermux, using MIMO and interference cancelling, receive antennas, and in the best circumstances, the increase in the number of channels could roughly be an order of magnitude. Now that's quite substantial. There are, again, we need to be very cautious about the figures. That's why I haven't put a number here, because it is so critically dependent on quite a large number of factors. And I think pretty much everybody is agreed, for example, in reality you wouldn't probably use the cross-polar MIMO stuff and the interference cancelling stuff because you'd need to replace domestic receive aerials. So that immediately takes away some of the gains that you might be able to achieve. However, nonetheless, whatever the figures, it's quite substantial. It's not just saying, well, you could get twice as many channels. It's some number bigger than that. But the interesting thing is we find that the gain actually varies from one country to another. And actually, even in some circumstances, could be negative. So, for example, we looked at the case of Italy. If you think of the geography of Italy, you've got surrounded by water on three sides, and you've got the Alps at the top. So their international coordination is a little bit easier than many other people who have a land border, where the other guy's transmitter is just across the border, and you have got a much more tight situation to make it all work. In Italy, they're actually planning to introduce in the next few years widespread single frequency networks, which I think are going to be 70% of the channels or thereabouts. And so they're going to achieve quite a low reuse figure anyway. And when you look at all the other constraints of how they might introduce a practical WiB system, they wouldn't actually do as well as the system that they're going to be putting in not using WiB. One last feature that some people got quite excited about is this ability to share spectrum by using an interference cancellation process. Imagine that we've got two signals here, S1 and S2, that are transmitted at different power levels. So S1 is the higher power of the two. And let's say that it needs a 5 dB carrier to interference ratio to be able to be demodulated. And let's say you transmit S2 8 dB down on S1. So that means that at a receiving site which receives that ratio of power, in principle, a demodulator for S1 would be able to look at that signal, demodulate it because it's above the threshold that's required for that signal. Using the error correction scheme built into it, you'd be able to recover effectively an unerrored bit stream, from which you can reconstruct the original signal that must have been coming in, and then use that to cancel out S1 on the signal that you're actually receiving. And that just leaves you with S2. And provided the cancellation goes deep enough and it leaves S2 with sufficient carrier to noise ratio and carrier to interference ratio that you can demodulate that as well, it means that both streams can be demodulated successfully. Now, there's a constraint we have to use here, and that is we've obviously got to maintain this power ratio. So that means that they've got to come from the same transmitting mast, ideally with the same horizontal radiation pattern on the transmit antenna, so that as you move around the patch, the power ratio remains constant. If they came from two different masts, as you moved around the coverage area for that, you'd find the ratios tilting about all over the place, and you'd lose this ability to be able to separate the two from being on top of each other. Now, some people got quite excited by this because you may be aware that a little while back, the 800 megahertz band was reallocated from broadcast use to mobile radio, and in the mobile phones rather. In the current situation, the same process is underway for the 700 megahertz band. So there was a fear that there might be eyes looking at some of that spectrum to go a bit further. And wouldn't it be nice if both broadcasters and mobile operators could use the spectrum, the same spectrum, at the same time? Nice theory, I think, actually. I mean, it sounds very attractive at the start. I have to say, somebody did once say to me, well, that'll never work because mobile phone operators are not actually the best at sharing with each other, let alone with broadcasters. So, but the other problem is that, of course, the network topologies are fundamentally different. Mobile comes from a densely packed network of relatively small, relatively low-powered masts, and broadcast tends to come from these great big sticks that are 1,000 feet tall with very high power. So there would have to be massive alignment of those two structures simply to stick with this rule about them coming from the same mast. So whilst initially it looks quite attractive, actually in the end it does look not so good. So now we come on to the bit about what does DVB do with this sort of stuff. Well, these blocks here roughly outline the sort of process that goes on in DVB. A decision is made in the far end block whether to proceed with developing a standard. Very often it's a no-brainer for the generating the second generation, for example, the T2s, C2s and S2s that we saw in an early slide. It was a fairly clear decision. It seemed pretty sensible to just go ahead and do that. We didn't need to do too much work to say, yes, that was a good thing to do. That decision then feeds into a group called the commercial module. And what that does is it develops the commercial requirements. And by that, it means a sort of description of what the technology should do and what business problems it should solve. Okay? We have this sort of unofficial ban of using the dreaded term decibel in commercial requirements documents. Normally we try and stick to this, but decibels are banned. They're only allowed in the technical specification, strictly speaking. So once those commercial requirements have been written and agreed, that then moves on to the technical module, who appoints a technical subgroup of specialists who then work on converting those requirements into a technical specification. And once that's been completed, that then goes on to the steering board just to make sure that everybody's happy with it there before it passes out to an external standards organization. 99 times out of 100, that's ETSI. There are some tweaks and circular bits on this map. It's not quite as simple as that, but I think that gives you a pretty good idea of where it's going. Now, in the case of WiB, we decided to stick a little bit in front of this. So what we did was we introduced a couple of groups in front. The first one was a commercial module study mission, which I had the pleasure of chairing. And the second one is a technical module study mission, which was chaired by Chris Noakes of BBC R&D. Now, these groups are designed to provide answers to the next block. In other words, it does all the work that says, is there a commercial case in general to do this thing? Is there a technical case in general? Will the technology actually work? And so the two reports from those two groups can be fed into the decision process, and the decision can be made whether to proceed or not. Now, I've called this the killer app because one of the commercial problems, and I'm going to focus mostly on those with some technical results coming in, when you're introducing a non-backwards compatible service like this, you've got to introduce new receivers. Particularly, okay, we've got the physical there, we've got the WiB itself, we've got perhaps new encoding, video encoding, and all the other things that I spoke about might be on the agenda. So existing receivers are not going to work, basically. So you need to have some kind of service that is attractive enough for people to want to go out and buy a box in sufficiently large numbers that commercially it works. And that's not always easy to achieve. So clearly the first thing to look at was to say, well, is that new service ultra-high definition? This is the thing that lots of people seem to be talking about. But actually there were some snags. When we began to talk to broadcasters and others about this, we discovered some very interesting facts. For example, one advertising funding broadcaster said to us, look, we get the same revenue from an ad slot in a standard definition program as we do in a high definition program, and we expect that if we had ultra high definition, we'd get the same. And furthermore, we'd be segmenting that audience somewhat, so we'd actually probably get a bit less for each, but so it wouldn't be 50% more because you've got SD, HD and UHD. It would probably be a bit less than that. So we'd have had to spend an enormous amount of money to implement this thing, and we're not going to get any extra revenue, so we're not really very interested. They also said that take-up of HD on terrestrial is disappointing. That was the word that they used. And actually, if you look in the UK, we're still transmitting lots of standard definition channels, and they were telling me that there isn't pressure, or much pressure, from these guys to migrate to higher definition ones. Only one broadcaster that we spoke to actually said they had a plan to put ultra-high def on DTT, and they were working on the basis that WiB didn't feature. They were going to be able to do this with DVB T2 and the latest generation video coding. We also found that some broadcasters have yet to decide. There are trials going on in 1 or 2 places, but some have definitely decided they will not put UHD on the terrestrial platform. So there goes our primary killer app for encouraging people to go and buy a box. The other thing we could do is more of the same, as in standard definition and high definition. But I really don't think that would encourage people to rush out and buy another box. If you're just giving them more, it's going to be more of what? The primary channels that actually mop up most of the audience, the BBCs and the ITVs and channels 4 and 5 and so on, are already there. They're expensive to create the content, so can't really see that being of great interest to a lot of viewers. Another thing that's really important to have, of course, is a migration path. So that means a route, a process to get you from where you are now with your network to where you think you'd like to be eventually. And we came up with a number of requirements for a migration path. First of all, it should minimize viewer disruption. What you don't want is people's screens going blank. So you've got to keep the existing services available until pretty much everybody is migrated to the new services. You've obviously got to offer attractive new content or services as well. You've got to minimize the cost to broadcasters. A lot of them have put their hands in their pockets quite a lot recently for re-engineering of the networks for digital and for 800 megahertz and 700 megahertz clearances. And also, you need to allow different countries or different markets to introduce WiB independently. So, you know, if the UK wanted to put a WiB network in and it depended on France doing it at the same time, that probably wouldn't work. So, let's just have a look at what a migration path might amount to. Let's say we got the starting point of the familiar blue high power transmissions. Notice that the starting point we're assuming here is DVB-T2 high power. In the UK, as I've already mentioned, not all our multiplexes are T2, so we'd have to finish that migration first to effectively to make this work. So the next step would be to convert, or could be to convert all of those multiplexes into a large array of 8 megahertz wide robust multiplexes occupying every channel available to us, all 28 channels. Now, each one of these multiplexes is actually backwards compatible with an existing receiver. But it's not going to get terribly many channels in there because you're looking at a payload of about 8 megabits per second in there. So you could get a few SD channels in there and maybe a couple of HDs, but not terribly much. But the capacity you can get if you fill the whole band like that is roughly the same as what you had in those high power multiplexes. Then the next step would be introduce a new single supermux signal underneath in layer division multiplex, for which you would need new receivers. Okay, so you can start selling the new receivers at this point, and hopefully lots of people would take them up to receive that UHD that you're not going to transmit. Your services begin to migrate across to the new receivers. And eventually, when you've got only a few of the old ones left, you can switch off the T2 and then it becomes a full WiB network. Now, when you start digging into this, there's a myriad of problems and it all gets terribly complicated. The technical study mission group had a good look at two particular models for migration paths. First one was where WiB was interleaved, as we'd shown it in a diagram a little way back, with the existing signals. They found that actually the WiB signals would cause unacceptable levels of interference into the existing DTT signals. So that wouldn't work. The second model would require simultaneous migration across neighbouring countries that I just mentioned a minute or two ago, and the use of this intermediate standard to avoid interference. And also, they'd have to not only synchronize the date of switching over, but they'd actually have to synchronize the transmissions to some extent as well. I won't go into that in too much detail, mainly because I don't understand it. And in the end, the study mission had to give up and say, we cannot find an acceptable migration path to get from the sort of networks we have at the moment, let's assume they're all T2, to a WiB one without breaking some of those rules that we set up, those 4 rules about not providing disruption to viewers and so on. We also have to think about other spectrum users. There's a little bit of TV white space action going on in this country, but only a relatively small amount as far as I'm aware. TV white space basically takes advantage of the fact that when you've got a reuse 5, 6, 7-ish sort of network, in a lot of areas, if you plug in an aerial and have a look at the spectrum analyzer, you will find a lot of channels that appear to be empty, and you can use those for low power transmission of data service for rural broadband, Internet of Things, all sorts of stuff. If you're looking at a WiB network, of course, we're sticking transmissions on every channel in every area, and therefore there'd be nothing left for TV white space. Perhaps, definitely a bigger problem is PMSE, Program Making and Special Events. This relates to the use of things like radio mics and in-ear monitoring and all sorts of things that are used by the entertainment industry. And PMSE makes considerable use of the UHF band at the moment on a coordinated basis. And basically, if you look at the size of the industry that we're looking at here, and it's not only television, but you're obviously looking at theatre and filmmaking and all sorts of people who are in the entertainment industry as a whole, all using large numbers of these devices. That would amount to considerable disruption. We found a European Commission report which had looked into this, and it had estimated a cost of 10 billion euros to replace 2 million links across Europe. So that would be a massive cost, and that's even if you can find the spectrum to put them in, because as we all know, there is massive demand for spectrum for all sorts of stuff these days. The next thing we began to look at was, well, what are the prospects anyway, if we don't do WiB, for actually expanding platforms? And we found a very useful survey from the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, as it says over on the left-hand side there, fairly recent January 2018 survey that looked at the modulation format and the video coding that was in use in various European countries. And so we stripped this data apart and came up with this pie chart that shows that DVB-T MPEG-4, for example, is the dark blue area. There are 11 countries doing that. And if you look at all of the ones that are DVB-T are involved in, that's all the way round from here to here. Okay? So that's roughly 70% of them. So there's quite a lot of people who are still using DVB-T in some form or other. Some of them are mixed with T2. There's a colour there for those who are using only T2, and then there's a different colour for T2 with HEVC, the latest, effectively the latest generation of video coding. So we've got 70% of European countries still using DVB-T. If they were to be able to move from T to T2, that could give something like 30 to 50% increase in bit rate simply by changing the modulation scheme. And moving from MPEG-2 to HEVC, for example, alone, that could increase the channel capacity in the same bit rate times 4. So there seems to be quite a bit that countries could do. And in addition, on top of this, many broadcasters are actually planning the growth of their services actually over the top, over the internet, so that they don't have the cost of the hardware infrastructures for the transmitter networks. So to conclude then, let's just try and summarize the things that we've found. WiB appears to offer an opportunity for greatly increased capacity, which could be used for more or better quality standard definition and high definition TV content, or for introducing UHD. That was the initial proposition, and that's what really made us want to kick off the piece of work. The problem is there's little demand for UHD or improved standard definition and high definition on DTT. Most platforms plan to expand using hybrid. Consumers would have to buy new receivers. Okay? Inevitably, that's going to lead to quite a bit of inertia. Reduced network capital and revenue costs do not justify writing off the book value of existing systems. A lot of systems are fairly new, okay, so they haven't been depreciated terribly much yet, and so there's still quite a significant book value. There's little point investing in a cheaper transmitter unless you were going to change the transmitter anyway, unless the revenue saving was going to make it pay back in some reasonably short period of time. Actually, when you do the sums, it doesn't work. Satisfactory migration paths have not been found. So that's, again, a major block. I have to say, it's possible that somebody doing a bit more work might be able to find something there, but until quite a lot more work on developing the ideas here has been done, we just don't know the answer to that one. Another problem is WiB would have to be introduced across a region, that is a number of countries, simultaneously, and there would be a serious impact on PMSE, that's the program making and special events, and on TV white space. And we've shown there's significant potential scope to improve networks without actually using WiB technology. So that's what the two groups actually both independently proposed, that we shouldn't do any more. And on the 5th of July this year, the DVB steering board approved both study mission reports and decided not to develop WiB into a standard specification, which I know, as Dave said right at the start, was quite disappointing actually for some people. We certainly thought it had great promise when we started the work, but there was no escaping these several conclusions that really brought it to a halt. If you'd like to see the reports, they've both been run into one document, and it's available at this URL. If you can't scribble that down too fast, I'm sure you should be able to find it from the dvb.org homepage. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. That's my run around DVB and some of its processes, and why it reached perhaps a slightly surprising conclusion on this rather apparently interesting technology. Thank you.